I was 16 when my world shattered like glass hitting concrete, the pieces cutting deep enough to leave scars that would never fully heal. The smell of burnt coffee and stale cigarettes filled our cramped kitchen that morning, mixing with the sour scent of my stepfather Rick's cologne that he splashed on too heavily, as if trying to mask something rotten underneath. The fluorescent light above our breakfast table buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face as he sat there reading the newspaper, his thick fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had seen better days. Mom was at the stove, her back turned to us both, the sound of eggs crackling in the pan filling the uncomfortable silence that had become our family's morning ritual. Her shoulders were hunched forward in that way they always were when Rick was around, like she was trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. The wooden spoon in her hand scraped against the cast-iron skillet with a metallic screech that made my teeth ache. I should have known something was wrong the moment Rick looked up from his paper and smiled at me. It wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes, but rather the predatory grin of someone who had just figured out how to solve a problem that had been bothering them for months. His teeth were yellowed from years of smoking, and there was a cold calculating look in his pale blue eyes that made my stomach twist into knots. "Morning, kiddo," he said, his voice carrying that fake cheerfulness that I had learned to fear over the past 3 years since he had moved in with us. The way he said kiddo always made my skin crawl, like he was marking his territory, claiming ownership over something that didn't belong to him. I mumbled a response and reached for the orange juice, my hand shaking slightly as I poured it into my glass. The pulp swirled around like tiny bits of debris in murky water, and I found myself staring at it, trying to avoid meeting Rick's gaze. Outside our kitchen window, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking incessantly, a sharp yapping sound that seemed to echo the anxiety building in my chest. Mom finally turned around, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. They were overcooked, dry and rubbery the way they always were when she was nervous. Her hands trembled as she set the plate down, and I noticed the fresh bruise on her wrist, purple and green like a sick flower blooming on her pale skin. She caught me looking and quickly pulled her sleeve down, her eyes darting toward Rick before settling on some invisible spot on the wall behind my head. "Eat up, honey," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the persistent hum of the refrigerator. "You don't want to be late for school." But Rick had other plans. He folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, the sound of crisp paper echoing through our small kitchen like the crack of a whip. "Actually, Sarah, I was thinking maybe the boy should stay home today. Help me with some work around the house." The way he said the boy instead of using my name always made me feel like I was some stray animal he had reluctantly agreed to feed. Mom's fork clattered against her plate, and I saw her jaw tighten, that muscle in her cheek twitching the way it did when she was fighting back words she knew better than to say. "He has finals coming up, Rick," she said carefully, each word measured and weighed before it left her lips. "His grades are important." Rick's laugh was cold and harsh, like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. "Grades aren't gonna matter much where he's headed, Sarah. Trust me on that." At the time, I thought he was just being his usual cruel self, taking another jab at my academic performance which, admittedly, had suffered since he had entered our lives. The constant tension in our house made it hard to concentrate on homework when I was always listening for the sound of his heavy footsteps on the creaky floorboards, waiting for the next explosion that would send Mom retreating to their bedroom with tears streaming down her face. But looking back now, sitting in this cold concrete cell with nothing but time to think, I realized that Rick's comment that morning was more than just cruelty. It was a preview of coming attractions, a glimpse into the elaborate trap he had been setting for months, maybe even years, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it closed around my neck. The eggs turned to ash in my mouth as Rick continued to stare at me with that calculating expression. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in around us like we were trapped in a box that was slowly shrinking. I could smell the dampness from the basement seeping up through the floorboards, mixing with the acrid scent of Rick's cigarettes and creating an atmosphere so thick with dread that it was hard to breathe. Mom cleared her throat, the sound small and fragile in the heavy silence. "Maybe I should drive him to school today. Make sure he gets there safely." "No need," Rick said, his voice carrying an edge of finality that made it clear the discussion was over. "I've got some errands to run anyway. I'll drop him off on my way." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I almost believed it myself. Rick never volunteered to drive me anywhere, and the idea of him going out of his way to make sure I got to school safely was about as likely as snow falling in July. But Mom just nodded, her face pale and resigned, like a person who had given up fighting battles she knew she couldn't win. I finished my breakfast in silence, the food sitting heavy in my stomach like a stone. The clock on the microwave read 7:15, and I knew that if I didn't leave soon, I would be late for first period. But Rick seemed to be in no hurry, taking his time finishing his coffee and flipping through the sports section with the casual indifference of someone who had all the time in the world. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he pushed back from the table with a scraping sound that made me wince. "Ready to go, kiddo?" I grabbed my backpack from the floor beside my chair, the weight of my textbook suddenly feeling overwhelming. My chemistry book, my history notes, my half-finished English essay about the American dream, all of it seemed pointless now, though I couldn't have explained why. There was something in the air that morning, something electric and dangerous, like the feeling you get right before a thunderstorm breaks open the sky. Mom followed us to the front door, her bare feet silent on the worn linoleum. She reached out as if to touch my shoulder, then pulled her hand back, her fingers curling into a fist at her side. "Have a good day at school, sweetheart," she said, but her voice sounded hollow, like she was reading lines from a script she didn't believe. Rick's truck was parked in our driveway, a rusted-out Ford pickup that burned oil and sounded like it was on its last legs. The passenger door creaked when he opened it, the hinges protesting with a metallic groan that seemed to echo off the houses in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I climbed in, the torn vinyl seat scratching against my jeans, and Rick slammed the door behind me with more force than necessary. The interior of the truck smelled like stale beer and motor oil, with an underlying scent of something sour and unpleasant that I had never been able to identify. Empty fast food containers littered the floor, and there was a hole in the dashboard where the radio used to be, just a tangle of colored wires that Rick had never bothered to fix. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine coughing and sputtering before finally turning over with a reluctant wheeze. Black smoke poured from the exhaust pipe, and I could see Mrs. Henderson from next door peek through her curtains with a disapproving frown. Rick caught her looking and raised his middle finger in her direction, laughing when she quickly ducked back inside. "Nosy old bat," he muttered, shifting the truck into reverse. "Always sticking her nose where it don't belong." We backed out of the driveway and onto Maple Street, the truck's transmission grinding in protest. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar sights of my neighborhood, the houses where I had played as a child, the corner store where I bought candy with my allowance, the park where Mom used to push me on the swings before Rick came into our lives and everything changed. But instead of heading toward the high school, Rick turned left at the intersection, taking us in the opposite direction toward the industrial part of town where the factories and warehouses squatted like concrete monsters against the gray morning sky. My stomach clenched with a sudden surge of anxiety, and I turned to look at him, confusion and fear battling for control in my chest. "The school's the other way," I said, my voice coming out smaller and more uncertain than I had intended. Rick glanced at me with that same cold smile from breakfast, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "We're not going to school today, kiddo. Got something more important to take care of first." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Outside the truck, the familiar streets of my childhood were giving way to unfamiliar territory, empty lots filled with weeds and broken glass, abandoned buildings with boarded-up windows like blind eyes staring at nothing. The sky overhead was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of rain, and the air tasted metallic and sharp. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "Rick, I need to get to school. I have a test in chemistry today." His laugh was harsh and bitter, like the sound of metal scraping against stone. "Chemistry, huh? Well, you're about to get a real education, boy. The kind they don't teach in school." We were deep in the warehouse district now, surrounded by towering concrete buildings and rusted metal fencing topped with razor wire. The streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck, and the sound of our engine echoed off the walls like a death rattle. I could smell the river nearby, that brackish scent of stagnant water and industrial runoff that always made me think of decay and things better left buried. Rick pulled into an alley between two abandoned warehouses, the truck's tires crunching over broken glass and debris. He killed the engine, and suddenly the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the highway and the occasional drip of water from a broken pipe somewhere in the shadows. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I didn't move. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay in the truck, to demand that he take me home, to do anything but follow him into that dark alley where anything could happen and no one would hear me scream. But Rick's hand was already on the door handle, and there was something in his eyes that told me resistance would only make things worse. I said get out, he repeated, and this time there was an edge of violence in his voice that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. I opened the passenger door and climbed out on unsteady legs, my sneakers splashing in a puddle of oily water that reflected the gray sky above us like a dark mirror. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and I could hear the scratching of rats moving through the garbage that had accumulated in the corners of the alley. Rick walked around to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate with a metallic clang that echoed off the warehouse walls. Inside the truck bed was a large canvas duffel bag that I had never seen before, along with a shovel and what looked like a coil of rope. My heart started hammering in my chest so hard that I was sure he could hear it, and my mouth went dry as dust. "Help me with this," he said, grabbing one end of the duffel bag. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being was telling me to turn around and sprint back toward the street, to find help, to get as far away from Rick and whatever he had planned as humanly possible. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was reeling with the implications of what I was seeing. The duffel bag was heavy, much heavier than it should have been for its size, and it made a strange clanking sound when we lifted it. Rick's face was grim and focused as we carried it deeper into the alley, toward a metal door set into the side of one of the warehouses. The door was painted green, though most of the paint had peeled away over the years, leaving behind patches of rust that looked like dried blood in the dim light. "What's in the bag, Rick?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. He set his end down and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a key ring with a single brass key attached. "Nothing you need to worry about, kiddo. Just do what I tell you and everything will be fine." But everything was not fine, and we both knew it. The key turned in the lock with a heavy click, and the door swung open to reveal a dark interior that smelled of motor oil and something else, something organic and rotten that made my stomach lurch. Rick picked up his end of the bag again and jerked his head toward the open doorway. "Come on. Let's get this over with." The warehouse was vast and empty, filled with shadows that seemed to move and shift in the dim light filtering through grimy windows set high in the walls. Our footsteps echoed off the concrete floor, and somewhere in the darkness I could hear the sound of water dripping steadily, like a metronome counting down to something terrible. Rick led me to a spot near the center of the warehouse, where someone had cleared away the dust and debris to create a small open area. There were tire tracks in the dirt, recent ones, and I realized with growing horror that Rick had been here before, that this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision but something he had been planning for a long time. We set the duffel bag down, and Rick unzipped it with deliberate slowness, like he was savoring the moment. Inside were dozens of small plastic bags filled with white powder, more drugs than I had ever seen in one place, enough to supply half the high school for months. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to my knees on the cold concrete, staring at the contents of the bag with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "Jesus, Rick," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the cavernous space. "What have you done?" He looked down at me with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been mixed with so much cold calculation. "I've solved the problem, kiddo. See, your mother's been getting ideas lately. Talking about leaving, taking you with her. And I can't have that." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, creating a picture so ugly and twisted that I could barely comprehend it. "You're going to frame me," I said, the words coming out flat and emotionless as the full scope of his plan became clear. "Smart boy," Rick said, lighting his cigarette with hands that didn't shake at all. "Anonymous tip to the police about suspicious activity in an abandoned warehouse. They show up and find you here with enough drugs to put you away until you're 30. Your mother won't leave me if her precious son is in prison, will she? She'll need me to help pay for lawyers, to put money in your commissary account, to be the shoulder she cries on when visiting hours are over. Continua a historia." The horror of it washed over me like ice water, freezing my blood and making it hard to think. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me, and I remained kneeling on the concrete floor like I was praying to some cruel god who had already decided my fate. The smell of Rick's cigarette mixed with the musty air of the warehouse, creating a nauseating cocktail that made my head spin. "You can't do this," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew how pathetic they sounded.
Mom will know. She'll figure it out. Rick's laugh was like broken glass grinding underfoot. Will she? Your grades have been slipping, you've been moody and rebellious, staying out late with those friends of yours. Won't be hard to convince her that you fell in with the wrong crowd, started dealing to make some easy money. Hell, she's probably half expecting something like this already. The terrible thing was that he was right. My behavior had changed since he moved in with us, but not for the reasons he was suggesting. I had become withdrawn and angry because I couldn't stand watching what he was doing to my mother, couldn't bear the sight of her flinching every time he raised his voice or the way she had started apologizing for things that weren't her fault. I had started spending more time away from home because being there meant watching the woman who had raised me slowly disappear, replaced by someone scared and broken who jumped at shadows. Please, I said, hating the way my voice cracked on the word. Don't do this. I'll do anything you want. I'll stop giving you trouble, I'll stay out of your way. Too late for that, kiddo. Rick took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled the smoke in my direction. See, this isn't just about you giving me trouble. This is about insurance. As long as you're locked up, your mother needs me. She won't leave, won't file for divorce, won't do anything that might jeopardize her son's chances of getting out early for good behavior. He walked over to where I was kneeling and crouched down so that his face was level with mine. Up close, I could see the broken blood vessels in his nose from years of drinking, could smell the sour scent of beer on his breath mixed with the acrid smoke of his cigarette. His pale blue eyes were completely devoid of warmth or human compassion, like looking into the eyes of a shark. This is going to happen whether you cooperate or not, he said, his voice soft and conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. But if you make this difficult, if you try to run or fight back, I'll make sure your mother pays the price. You understand what I'm saying? I understood. The thread hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything it touched. Rick didn't need to spell it out for me. I had seen the bruises on Mom's arms, had heard the sounds coming from their bedroom late at night when she thought I was asleep. I knew exactly what he was capable of, and I knew he would follow through on his threat without hesitation. What do you want me to do? I asked, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. Rick smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen on a human face. Just sit tight, kiddo. Won't be long now. He stood up and walked back toward the entrance of the warehouse, pulling out a cell phone as he went. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see him gesturing as he spoke, his voice carrying across the empty space as an indistinct murmur. After a few minutes, he ended the call and walked back over to where I was still kneeling beside the duffel bag full of drugs. Police should be here in about 20 minutes, he said, grinding his cigarette butt under his heel. Anonymous tip about suspicious activity. They'll find you here with all this merchandise and draw their own conclusions. What about you? I asked. How are you going to explain not being here? Rick pulled out his wallet and showed me a receipt. Gas station on 5th Street, timestamped 15 minutes from now. I'll be there buying coffee and cigarettes when the cops bust down that door. Perfect alibi. The plan was flawless in its simplicity, and I realized that Rick had been thinking about this for months, maybe even years, working out every detail, anticipating every possible complication. He had studied me like a scientist studies a lab rat, learning my habits and weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. You won't get away with this, I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. Already have, kiddo. Rick headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at me one last time. Oh, and don't bother trying to run. I'll be watching from across the street until the cops show up. If you so much as stick your nose outside that door, your mother will regret it for the rest of her short life. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in that cavernous warehouse with a fortune in drugs and the sound of my own ragged breathing echoing off the concrete walls. I could hear his truck starting up outside, the engine coughing and sputtering as he drove away to establish his alibi and set the final phase of his plan in motion. I sat there in the dust and gloom, staring at the bags of white powder that would destroy my life, and tried to think of some way out of the trap that was closing around me. But every option I considered led to the same terrible conclusion. Rick held all the cards, and he had thought of everything. If I ran, Mom would pay the price. If I tried to tell the truth,
Who would believe the word of a teenage drug dealer against the testimony of an upstanding stepfather who was just trying to do right by his troubled family? The minutes crawled by like hours, each second marked by the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the hammering of my heart against my ribs. I thought about my mother, probably at home right now wondering why I wasn't at school, maybe even starting to worry. By tonight, she would know the truth, or at least Rick's version of it. She would sit in some sterile police station waiting room while detectives asked her questions about my behavior, my friends, whether she had suspected that her son was dealing drugs. And she would blame herself. That was the part that hurt the most, knowing that Mom would spend the rest of her life wondering what she had done wrong, how she had failed as a parent, never realizing that the man sleeping beside her every night was the one who had orchestrated her son's downfall for his own twisted purposes. I heard the sound of car doors slamming outside, followed by heavy footsteps and the crackle of police radios. My time was up. In a few seconds, they would break down that door and find me sitting next to enough drugs to make the evening news, and my life as I knew it would be over. Police. Search warrant. The door exploded inward with a thunderous crash, splinters of wood flying through the air like shrapnel. Bright flashlight beams cut through the gloom, and suddenly the warehouse was full of shouting voices and the sound of boots on concrete. I raised my hands above my head, blinded by the lights, and waited for the inevitable. Don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them. A police officer grabbed me by the shoulders and spun me around, pressing my face against the cold concrete while he snapped handcuffs around my wrists. The metal was cold against my skin, and I could smell gun oil and leather from his utility belt. Other officers were examining the contents of the duffel bag, their voices excited as they realized the magnitude of their bust. Jesus Christ, look at all this stuff. Kid, you're in a world of trouble. They hauled me to my feet and read me my rights, the words washing over me like white noise. I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about Rick, probably sitting in that gas station right now, buying coffee and cigarettes and putting on a show of concerned stepfather for the security cameras. In a few hours, he would get a call from the police telling him that his stepson had been arrested, and he would rush to the station with my mother, both of them playing their roles in his elaborate performance. The ride to the police station passed in a blur of streetlights and radio chatter. I sat in the back seat of the patrol car, my hands cuffed behind me, staring out the window at the city I had grown up in, knowing that I might not see it again as a free person for many years to come. The officer driving kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, probably wondering how someone my age had gotten involved with that much product. If only he knew. The police station was a study in institutional beige, all fluorescent lights and worn linoleum that had seen too many people at the worst moments of their lives. They processed me like a piece of meat, taking my fingerprints and mugshots, emptying my pockets and cataloging my belongings. The booking officer was a tired-looking woman with graying hair who had probably seen it all, and she treated me with the weary indifference of someone who dealt with drug dealers every day. First offense, she asked, not really looking at me as she filled out the paperwork. I didn't do anything, I said, though I knew how pathetic it sounded. She looked up at me then, and for just a moment I saw something that might have been sympathy in her eyes. That's what they all say, kid. Lawyer will be here in the morning to sort it out. They put me in a holding cell with 3 other men, all of them older and harder than me, with the kind of prison tattoos and dead eyes that spoke of lives spent in and out of the system. I sat in the corner and tried to make myself invisible, listening to their conversation about parole officers and court dates and which judges were most likely to show mercy. "What you in for, boy?" asked a man with arms like tree trunks and a spider web tattooed on his neck. "Drugs," I said, because it was easier than trying to explain the truth. He nodded approvingly. "Good money in that, if you don't get caught." "How much they find on you?" "A lot," I said, and left it at that. The night dragged on forever, punctuated by the sound of drunks being brought in and the occasional fight breaking out in one of the other cells. I lay on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, thinking about my mother and wondering if she was lying awake too, trying to make sense of what had happened to her son. Morning came with the clatter of breakfast trays and the shuffle of tired corrections officers making their rounds. My court-appointed attorney was a young woman named Jennifer Martinez who looked like she had just graduated from law school. She sat across from me in a small conference room and listened to my story with the expression of someone who had heard it all before. "Let me get this straight," she said when I finished.
You're claiming that your stepfather planted drugs on you as part of an elaborate scheme to keep your mother from leaving him? I know how it sounds, I said. But it's the truth. She flipped through the police report, her brow furrowed in concentration. They found you in possession of approximately 5 pounds of cocaine with a street value of over $200,000. That's not a plant, Marcus. That's a major distribution operation. I never sold drugs in my life, I insisted. Ask anyone at school. Check my bank account. Where would I get the money to buy that much product? That's actually a good point, she admitted. The prosecution is going to have trouble explaining how a 16-year-old with no prior record and no visible means of income suddenly became a major player in the drug trade. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the truth would come out after all. Maybe someone would see through Rick's lies and realize what had really happened. But that hope was short-lived. Continua a historia. The next morning, my attorney returned with new information that drained the color from her face and made my stomach drop like a stone. She sat across from me in that same sterile conference room, but this time she wouldn't meet my eyes, shuffling through papers with the nervous energy of someone who had just received very bad news. Marcus, she said slowly, we have a problem. A big one. The fluorescent light above us buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across her face and making her look older than her years. Outside the small window, I could see the parking lot of the police station, where normal people went about their normal lives, completely unaware that mine was being systematically destroyed by a man who had planned every detail with the precision of a chess master. What kind of problem? I asked, though I was already bracing myself for another devastating blow. Jennifer spread several photographs across the table between us, surveillance images that were grainy but clear enough to make my blood run cold. They showed me, unmistakably me, entering and leaving various locations around the city, always carrying a backpack or duffel bag, always looking nervous and checking over my shoulder like someone engaged in illegal activity. These were taken over the past 6 months, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The prosecution has evidence that you've been dealing drugs for a lot longer than anyone initially thought. I stared at the photographs, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. The images were real, that much was obvious, but the context was completely wrong. I recognized some of the locations from Rick's errands, places he had asked me to go while he waited in the truck, claiming he needed to pick up tools or equipment for various odd jobs he claimed to be working. That's impossible, I said, pointing to a photograph that showed me coming out of a pawn shop downtown. I remember this day. Rick asked me to go in and get a quote on some old tools while he stayed in the truck. I was in there for maybe 5 minutes. According to the shop owner, you were there to fence stolen goods, Jennifer said. He's prepared to testify that you brought in electronics and jewelry on multiple occasions, always paying in cash. The room felt like it was spinning around me, the walls closing in like the trash compactor scene from Star Wars. Rick hadn't just planted drugs on me, he had been setting up this frame job for months, using me as an unwitting accomplice in his schemes, making sure there was a paper trail that would support his version of events. He's been planning this for a long time, I said, more to myself than to Jennifer. Every errand, every favor he asked me to do. He was building a case against me. Jennifer looked at me with something that might have been pity. Marcus, I want to believe you, I really do. But the evidence is overwhelming. The prosecution has surveillance footage, witness testimony, and now this drug bust. They're offering a plea deal, 15 years with the possibility of parole in 10 if you cooperate and give them information about your suppliers. I don't have any suppliers. I shouted, loud enough that the guard outside looked in through the reinforced glass window. I never sold drugs, I never stole anything, I never did any of this. But even as I said it, I could see the doubt creeping into Jennifer's eyes. She was a public defender with too many cases and not enough time, and the evidence against me was compelling enough to convince anyone who didn't know the truth. From the outside, it looked like an open and shut case. Troubled teenager from a broken home turns to crime, gets in over his head, and finally gets caught with enough product to put him away for decades. There is another option, Jennifer said carefully. We could try to get your stepfather to testify on your behalf. As a character witness, someone who could vouch for your behavior at home. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter and metallic like blood in my mouth. "He won't do it," I said. "Trust me on that." "Why not?" "If he really cares about you, if he wants to help." "He doesn't." I cut her off, my voice flat and defeated. "He's probably already planning what he's going to say to make me look even worse." And I was right. 3 days later, Rick appeared at the courthouse dressed in his best clothes, a cheap suit that he had probably bought specifically for this occasion. He played the role of the concerned stepfather perfectly, his face a mask of disappointed sorrow as he testified about my increasingly erratic behavior, my disrespect for authority, my association with what he called the wrong element. I sat at the defendant's table and watched him lie under oath, his performance so convincing that I almost believed it myself. He talked about finding drug paraphernalia in my room, about money that had gone missing from his wallet, about late-night phone calls that I would terminate as soon as he entered the room. Every word was carefully chosen to paint a picture of a teenager spiraling out of control, and the jury hung on his every syllable. "I tried to be a father to that boy," Rick said, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "But he was so angry, so full of rage. His mother and we did everything we could, but sometimes love isn't enough." Mom was sitting in the gallery behind me, and I could hear her crying softly as Rick spoke. She believed him. How could she not? He was her husband, the man she shared a bed with every night, and the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. It was easier to believe that her son had fallen in with drug dealers than to accept that the man she loved was capable of such elaborate cruelty. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Holloway, took Rick through his testimony with the skill of a surgeon, extracting every damaging detail and presenting it to the jury like evidence in a museum display. By the time she was finished, Rick looked like a saint, a man who had tried his best to save a troubled boy from his own worst impulses. My attorney tried to cross-examine him, to poke holes in his story, but Rick was too well prepared. He had answers for everything, explanations that sounded reasonable and plausible, the kind of responses that made the jury nod sympathetically. When Jennifer suggested that he might have ulterior motives for testifying against me, Rick looked genuinely hurt, like a man who had been falsely accused by someone he had tried to help. "Ma'am," he said, his voice heavy with wounded dignity, "that boy sitting right there is my stepson. You think I want to see him go to prison? You think this is easy for me? But I won't lie under oath, not even to protect someone I love. The truth is the truth, and Marcus needs help that I can't give him." It was a masterful performance, and I could see its effect on the jury. Several of them were looking at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, the way you might look at a rabid dog that needed to be put down for everyone's safety. In their minds, I had already been transformed from a victim into a predator, from an innocent teenager into a hardened criminal who had betrayed the trust of a man who had only tried to help. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence against me was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and my defense attorney was fighting an uphill battle with inadequate resources and limited time. When the jury returned their verdict, I wasn't surprised to hear the word guilty repeated 12 times, once for each count of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and possession with intent to distribute. The judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s who had probably seen every sob story in the book, sentenced me to 20 years in state prison with the possibility of parole in 15. As the bailiff led me away in shackles, I caught a glimpse of Rick in the gallery, his arm around my mother's shoulders as she wept. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw the triumph there, the cold satisfaction of a man who had successfully eliminated a threat to his comfortable life. But I also saw something else, something that gave me a tiny spark of hope in the darkness that was about to consume me. I saw fear. Because Rick knew, just as I knew, that the truth has a way of coming out eventually, and that sooner or later, someone would start asking the right questions. Continua a historia. Prison was exactly as brutal as I had imagined, but in ways I hadn't expected. The violence was there, certainly, the constant threat that hung in the air like humidity in summer, making everyone sweat and watch their backs. But worse than the physical danger was the psychological assault, the way the system stripped away your identity piece by piece until you forgot who you were before the walls and bars and concrete became your entire world. They sent me to Millfield Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison about 200 miles from home. The bus ride there was a journey into hell, shackled to a chain with a dozen other men who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose.
The man sitting next to me was serving life for murder, and he spent the entire trip explaining in graphic detail what happened to pretty boys like me who didn't know how to fight. My cellmate was a man named Carlos Rodriguez, a 35-year-old who had been locked up for armed robbery and had learned to survive by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. He was small and wiry, with scars on his arms that told stories he never shared, and eyes that had seen too much to ever look completely alive again. "First thing you gotta understand," he told me on my first night, as I lay on the thin mattress that would be my bed for the foreseeable future, "is that everything you thought you knew about life don't mean nothing in here. Your family, your friends, your plans for the future, all that's gone now. This is your world, and you better learn the rules fast if you want to survive." The rules were simple but brutal. Don't trust anyone completely. Don't show weakness. Don't get into debt. Don't start fights, but finish them if they come to you. And most importantly, don't believe the guards when they say they're there to help you, because they're just as much a part of the system that wants to break you as anyone else. I learned these lessons the hard way, through trial and error and more than a few beatings that left me battered and bruised but somehow still breathing. I got my nose broken in my second week by a man who decided I was looking at him wrong. I got stabbed with a sharpened spoon handle in my third month by someone who thought I had snitched about his drug operation, which I hadn't even known existed. But I survived, partly because Carlos watched my back and partly because I discovered that I had a talent for keeping my mouth shut and my head down. I worked in the prison library, shelving books and helping inmates fill out legal paperwork, and slowly I began to understand the system that had swallowed me whole. Most of the men in Millfield were there for reasons that made sense, even if you didn't agree with them. Poverty, addiction, desperation, bad choices made in worse circumstances. But there were others, like me, who had been caught up in situations beyond their control, victims of corrupt cops or overzealous prosecutors or elaborate frame jobs that had destroyed their lives for someone else's benefit. It was in the library that I met Thomas Brennan, a former police detective who had been convicted of taking bribes from drug dealers. Thomas was in his 50s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and he had a reputation for helping other inmates with their appeals and legal motions. More importantly, he had connections on the outside, people who owed him favors from his days as a cop. "Your case bothers me," he told me one afternoon as we sorted through a box of donated law books. "The evidence was too convenient, too neat. Real drug dealers don't get caught like that, sitting in an empty warehouse with 5 pounds of product and no backup plan." I had told him my story over several weeks, leaving out no detail, and he had listened with the patience of someone who had heard every lie and sob story in the book. But instead of dismissing my claims like everyone else had, Thomas began asking questions, probing for inconsistencies, testing my memory against itself. "Tell me about your stepfather again," he said. "Everything you can remember about his background, his job history, his habits." So I told him about Rick's long absences from home, his mysterious sources of income, his drinking problem that he thought he had better than he did. I told him about the bruises on my mother's arms, the way she had changed after he moved in with us, the fear that lived in her eyes like a permanent resident. Thomas took notes on everything, his handwriting small and precise, the way cops are trained to write reports that will hold up in court. After a month of these conversations, he sat back in his chair and looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Kid," he said, "I think you're telling the truth. And if you are, then your stepfather is a lot smarter and a lot more dangerous than anyone realized." It turned out that Thomas still had friends in law enforcement, people who had worked with him before his fall from grace and who were willing to do small favors for old time's sake. He put them to work investigating Rick's background, looking for inconsistencies in his story, checking into his financial records and employment history. What they found was disturbing. Rick's real name was Richard Kowalski, and he had a criminal record going back 20 years. Assault, fraud, forgery, domestic violence. He had been arrested more than a dozen times but had only served serious time once, for beating his first wife so badly that she had spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The charges in most of his other cases had been dropped or reduced, often because witnesses had suddenly become reluctant to testify. "He's got a pattern," Thomas explained, showing me copies of police reports that his contacts had obtained through unofficial channels. "He finds women with children, moves in with them, isolates them from their support systems, and then uses the kids as leverage to control the mother. If the woman tries to leave, bad things happen to the children.
The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. 3 different families over the past 15 years, 3 different women who had filed restraining orders that were later withdrawn, 3 different children who had ended up in trouble with the law after their mothers had tried to leave. In 2 cases, the children had been arrested for crimes they claimed they didn't commit. In the 3rd case, a 14-year-old girl had been found dead in what was ruled a suicide, though her mother insisted she would never have killed herself. "We need to find the other victims," Thomas said. "If we can establish a pattern of behavior, we might be able to get your case reopened." But finding the other victims proved to be more difficult than we had hoped. Rick was careful to move around, never staying in one place long enough to attract too much attention from local law enforcement. The women he targeted were usually vulnerable, isolated, with limited resources and no one to turn to for help. By the time we tracked them down, if we could track them down at all, they were often too frightened or too broken to talk. The first woman, Angela Martinez, had moved to another state after Rick left her family. When Thomas's contacts finally located her, she refused to discuss her relationship with Rick or what had happened to her son, who was serving a life sentence for murder in a Texas prison. The second woman, Jennifer Walsh, had died 2 years earlier in what was officially ruled an accidental overdose, though her sister insisted she had been clean for years. But the third woman, Catherine Brennan, was different. She was Thomas's own sister, which explained why he had taken such a personal interest in my case. Catherine had been married to Rick for 3 years in the early 2000s, and her daughter Sarah had been arrested for drug possession when she was 16, just like me. Sarah swore she was innocent. Catherine told us during a phone call that Thomas had arranged through his contacts on the outside. She said Rick had set her up, that he had planted drugs in her car to keep me from leaving him. But who was going to believe her? She was a troubled teenager, and Rick was a respected member of the community, volunteer firefighter, the whole 9 yards. Sarah had died in prison 2 years into her sentence, stabbed by another inmate during a fight over commissary privileges. Catherine had tried to investigate her daughter's claims after her death, but by then Rick had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but debts and heartbreak and the lingering smell of his cologne in closets that would never quite air out. "I know he killed my daughter," Catherine said, her voice breaking over the long-distance connection. "Maybe not with his own hands, but he might as well have. And if he's done it to other families, if he's still out there doing it, then someone needs to stop him." Thomas worked his contacts harder, calling in favors that he had been saving for his own appeals process. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a man who had perfected the art of psychological manipulation, who could destroy lives with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a reptile. Rick wasn't just an abusive husband, he was a predator who specialized in targeting families with teenage children, using those children as weapons against their own mothers. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. 3 different families, 3 different children who had been arrested for crimes they claimed they didn't commit, 3 different mothers who had been too frightened or too broken to fight back. It was enough to raise questions, but probably not enough to overturn a conviction that had been built on such solid-seeming evidence. That's when Thomas suggested something that made my blood run cold. "We need to catch him in the act," he said. "If he's still out there, if he's found another family to victimize, then we need to document it, get evidence that will stand up in court." The idea terrified me, partly because it meant Rick was still out there destroying lives, and partly because I knew my mother was still with him, still under his control, still vulnerable to his rage if he ever discovered what we were trying to do. But it was also the only way to prove my innocence and maybe save whatever other children Rick had in his sights. Thomas put together a network of former cops, private investigators, and legal advocates who had been touched in some way by Rick's crimes. They worked quietly, carefully, following paper trails and interviewing witnesses who had been too frightened to speak before. And slowly, like archaeologists uncovering the bones of some ancient monster, they began to expose the full scope of Rick's activities. He was currently living in a small town about 50 miles from where I had grown up, married to a woman named Lisa Patterson who had a 15-year-old son named Michael. According to their research, Lisa had recently filed for divorce, then withdrawn the papers after Michael had been arrested for shoplifting. The pattern was repeating itself, as predictable as clockwork, and we finally had our chance to document it. But documenting it meant putting another family at risk, and I wasn't sure I could live with myself if something happened to Michael Patterson because we had waited too long to act.
The weight of that responsibility sat on my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to think about anything else. "We have to try," Thomas insisted. "It's the only way to stop him, and it might be our only chance to get you out of here." Historia finalizada. 4 years into my sentence, the breakthrough finally came. Thomas's network had been patiently gathering evidence, and they had managed to place surveillance equipment in Rick's new home with the help of a private investigator who specialized in domestic abuse cases. What they captured on those recordings was enough to make hardened detectives sick to their stomachs. Rick's voice, cold and calculating, as he explained to Lisa Patterson exactly what would happen to her son Michael if she went through with the divorce. His detailed description of how he had framed other children, including me, spoken with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Most damning of all, his confession that he had been planning Michael's arrest for months, planting evidence, and building a case that would destroy the boy's life if his mother didn't comply with Rick's demands. The recordings were enough to convince the district attorney to reopen my case, and within 6 months I was back in court, this time with a team of experienced criminal defense attorneys who worked pro bono for victims of wrongful conviction. The same prosecutor who had put me away, Patricia Holloway, now stood before a judge and admitted that new evidence had come to light that cast serious doubt on my guilt. Rick was arrested at his new home, and this time there was no escape, no elaborate alibi, no way to talk his way out of the evidence that had been carefully and legally obtained. He was charged with perjury, witness tampering, evidence planting, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes related to his systematic abuse of multiple families over the course of decades. When I walked out of Millfield Correctional Facility on a cold December morning, I was 21 years old and completely unprepared for freedom. Thomas had been paroled 6 months earlier and was waiting for me in the parking lot, along with Catherine Brennan and a reporter from the local newspaper who wanted to write about my case. But the person I most wanted to see wasn't there. My mother had died 2 years earlier, succumbing to cancer that might have been treatable if she hadn't been too afraid and too broken to seek proper medical care. Rick had kept her isolated until the end, convincing her that her son's criminal behavior had brought shame on the family, that she didn't deserve help or sympathy or even basic human dignity. She died believing I was guilty, believing that she had failed as a mother, never knowing that the man sleeping beside her was the architect of all her suffering. That knowledge sits in my chest like a piece of broken glass, cutting me every time I breathe, reminding me that some wounds never heal no matter how much time passes. Rick was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fitting end for someone who had destroyed so many lives for his own twisted purposes. But his conviction couldn't bring back Sarah Brennan or my mother or the years I had lost behind bars. It couldn't erase the things I had seen and done and suffered in order to survive in a place where innocence was just another word for weakness. Today, I work with organizations that help victims of wrongful conviction, sharing my story with anyone who will listen, trying to prevent other families from being destroyed by predators like Rick. It's not easy work, and it doesn't pay much, but it gives meaning to the suffering, transforms the pain into something that might actually help someone else. Sometimes I think about what my life might have been like if Rick had never entered it, if my mother had never fallen for his lies, if I had gone to school that morning instead of climbing into his truck. But those thoughts are like staring into an abyss, and I've learned that the only way to survive is to keep moving forward, to find purpose in the wreckage, to believe that somehow, somewhere, justice still matters. The truth did come out eventually, just as I had always believed it would. But the cost of that truth was higher than I ever imagined, paid in years I can never get back and innocence I can never reclaim. Sometimes justice isn't enough, but it's all we have, and sometimes all we have has to be enough.